Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about prejudice and sort of inequality, I guess, more generally, but the different ways in which inequality kind of psychologically manifests. And, in many ways we've anticipated this topic throughout the semester, right? Intergroup conflict, prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination. We have sort of discussed all of these issues in some form and varying levels already, but I think it's a very important topic for all kinds of self-evident reasons, right? This is a very important issue in our society and presumably every other society. And so we're sort of going to turn our gaze to it directly rather than sort of side-eyeing it like we've been doing throughout the rest of the course. And another reason that this topic is so important for us to discuss directly is because prejudice is actually one of the most studied topics in social psychology. And it's especially popular here at York. So, for example, Carrie Kawakami and Jen Steele are both social psychologists who focus their research on prejudice. And there's a variety of reasons that it's such a widely studied topic in psychology. There are plenty of really grave examples of inequality and prejudice and discrimination in both the recent past and the distant past, right, throughout all of history, basically. And it's also notable because it's been an active force in every culture that we're aware of. No group has ever been immune to prejudice, like enacting it in some way that we're aware of. And, it can be enacted upon women, upon people who are poor or less wealthy, on different ethnic groups, or like on different strata of society that can't be defined so easily. So, for example, the lowest castes in India, in the sort of strict caste system that they have in India, or this sort of, quote, untouchable classes, like the Burakumin in Japan. Many cultures have these sorts of, again, quote, untouchables. And Western societies have more recently become kind of explicitly, at least, more interested in prejudice, identifying it, measuring it, mitigating it and its effects, or at least people certainly say that they're interested in it. A lot of mouth service is paid to it. So for all these reasons, it's a very important topic for us to discuss. So let's get into it. So today, I'm hoping that you'll leave understanding a little bit more of the psychological mechanics of prejudice. So hopefully you'll be able to define and distinguish between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. And I also want you to understand a little bit about what the kind of psychological origins of prejudice might be. What are the psychological causes of prejudice? And so specifically, we're going to discuss Gordon Allport's 3 causes of prejudice. And we're also going to talk about the relationship between prejudice and personality, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding of how personality can predispose some people towards prejudicial attitudes. Specifically, we're going to be talking about right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. And finally, we're going to talk about the manifestations of prejudice. So you should be able to understand some of the different forms of discrimination, like ambivalent and aversive racism. You should be able to define and distinguish between these. And you should understand the sort of more general concept of implicit prejudice that's sort of so important in social psychology. So hopefully you'll also have an understanding of the role of implicit prejudice in social psychology, and a little bit of how it's been studied and what some of the challenges with it, with studying it, are. Okay, so let's get into it. So let's start at the beginning. a formal definition of prejudice. So prejudice is a negative attitude held toward an individual based on their presumed membership in a group. So this means that the attitude is based on the perception of the individual who is prejudiced, rather than like the personal attributes or the actions of the target of the prejudice. How do I put that in a more clear way? It's not based on anything about the individual that is being prejudiced against, except for the fact that they belong to some group, or at least, they're presumed to belong to some group. And so this also means that prejudice can be deployed, quote unquote, incorrectly, wherein someone is prejudiced against another based on the presumption of that person belonging to a certain group, even if that presumption is incorrect. That's a lot of sort of tricky language. So we're just going to take a quick second to watch this clip, and then we'll discuss it with this sort of extended example.
Why don't you get an apple from someone who doesn't hate our country, Brett?
Thanks so much.
Excuse me, I'd like to buy this apple, please.
New Zealander, stop touching my fruit. It's not allowed.
What's wrong with New Zealanders?
Hey, Neela! Can we bleach this one up? It's been infected?
I want to buy that. I'll pay for it.
No, not this apple, New Zealandy. You can buy apples from over there, my special New Zealand section. $10 a piece.
There's a dog in the New Zealand section.
Well, it's for dogs from America and people from New Zealand.
Yeah, you're being racist.
How dare you call me a racist?
He doesn't mean racist, he means xenophobic.
Oh, you're being xenophobic.
You know what? Just get lost, New Zealanders.
I'm not going anywhere till I get a red delicious and a banana.
You want a brown delicious to the face?
No?
You want to make trouble for me? Huh?
I don't. Brett was sort of driving the situation.
We're not going anywhere till we get an apple.
I'm going to count to 10.
Are you counting in your head?
Yeah,
What are you up to?
7.
Oh.
Yeah, get your shitty bikes and get out of here before I peel your beard off.
Lee,
Yeah.
let me finish. I'm a person. Brett's a person.
Yeah.
You're a person. That person over there's a person.
All-
And each person deserves to be treated like a person.
It's a great speech. Too bad New Zealanders are a bunch of cocky a-holes descended from criminals.
And you're thinking of Australians.
Yeah, that's
Those
Australians.
Australians.
No, New Zealanders. They throw another shrimp on the barbie, ride around in your kangaroos all day.
No,
that's Australians.
You're thinking of Australians, that's not us.
I've totally confused you with Australians. I feel terrible.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Your accents, they're just kind of similar.
Our accents are completely different. They're like, where's the car? And we're like, where's the car?
You know what? Hey,
Completely.
have some of my fruit, please. I feel terrible. Do you want that Red Delicious still?
Oh, I would love the red delicious,
Hey,
yeah.
this Red Delicious is on me. You still want that banana?
Thank
I
you.
love that banana.
Yeah.
Oh my-
Here you go.
Oh, that's
Hey,
so crazy.
I'm Sinjay.
I'm Jermaine. Good to meet you.
Brett.
Neela, you can uncover your eyes. They're not Australians. They're New Zealanders.
So this is a clip from the show Flight of the Conchords, and I use it because it's funny and light, and we can use it to sort of illustrate these concepts. We can get into the more sort of serious examples later, but here the fruit vendor is displaying a prejudice against Australians, but he sort of mixes them up with New Zealanders, and so has his prejudicial attitude towards Brett and Jermaine, the two people trying to buy fruit, but it's actually a mistaken, or quote unquote mistaken, or quote unquote incorrect prejudice, because he presumes them to be part of a group that they're actually not part of, and so in this case, the prejudice isn't even sort of like correct according to its own logic, because it has nothing to do with the individual who's the target. It has more to do with the attitudes of the person with the with the prejudicial attitude, and with the way that they perceive the target. And so, as is also clear in this video, prejudice is often justified using stereotypes. And we actually already discussed stereotypes this semester, but by way of reminder, these are schemata that we hold about a particular group. And then the schema is then applied to an individual based on their presumed membership within that group. And so, for example, this fruit vendor identifies a few stereotypes that he holds about New Zealanders, but they're stereotypes of Australians. So just try to think to yourself for a second about what some of these stereotypes, what the sort of content of this stereotype was that the fruit vendor held. So, no offense to the lovely people of Australia, of course, but the fruit vendor suggests that they're cocky a-holes, that they're descended from criminals, that they say throw another shrimp on the Barbie, and that they ride around in kangaroos. So these are the sorts of stereotypes. This is the content, I guess, of the stereotype that the fruit vendor holds about Australians. But it is also worth noting that not all stereotypes are negative. So, for example, in North America, it's a commonly held stereotype that East Asians and South Asians are very hard workers, that they'll achieve higher levels of education and income. But it's actually generally accepted that even though these stereotypes have sort of a positive content in a way, that the outcomes of those, again, sort of positive stereotypes, the outcomes of those stereotypes are negative. And so, for example, this particular stereotype about East Asians and South Asians is kind of collectively known as the model minority myth. And there's actually research done here at York by your earlier guest lecturer, Jessica Paget, that suggests that endorsing these stereotypes can have negative psychological and social consequences for Asian Canadians. And then finally, prejudice is enacted through discrimination. And so discrimination is the negative behavior toward the individual based on the presumed membership within that group. So in this video, the fruit vendor won't sell Brett and Jermaine the fruit because he assumes that they're Australian. So this is the discriminatory behavior. He won't, serve them in his business. So remember that prejudice is the negative attitude. Stereotypes are the schemata or the beliefs that one holds about a group. And then discrimination is the behavior that's enacted against an individual, the sort of negative behavior that is the outcome. And these are separate concepts. And so it's important that you understand the distinction between them and that you don't conflate them, that you sort of keep them clear and keep usage of them clear, especially in sort of scientific and academic circles. So, for example, I might be personally prejudiced against Australians, but if I never have an Australian in my class, then I can't discriminate against them in my class, if you know what I mean. Kind of a silly example, but on the topic of discrimination, it's important to note that discrimination can actually be conscious or unconscious. It doesn't have to be sort of as explicit as the fruit vendor demonstrated. So, for example, if several applications come into a place of work for a job, the people evaluating those applications may not be sort of consciously or explicitly prejudiced against a particular group, but they might sort of unconsciously discriminate against a particular individual by reading their name and realizing that they're, from a certain ethnic group, for example. And it might just cause them to, again, unconsciously evaluate that job applicant as being weaker than they actually are. Of course, they can do it explicitly as well. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Just trying to clarify that, it can happen in this kind of subtle or more unconscious way. And on the topic of this sort of job interview example, which is, an important one with actual real ramifications, but is also a commonly studied one, this sort of unconscious discrimination doesn't tend to happen in cases where the applicant is very weak or very strong, because in those cases, it's almost like it would be too difficult to subtly or unconsciously discriminate. But it's in the middling cases. It's in the gray area, If an applicant, if there's two applicants and, one is white and the other is non-white, and they're both basically the same, that's when sort of this unconscious, subtle discrimination might kind of rear its head. Hopefully that makes sense. And, if prejudice is this prominent feature of human societies across time, across space, sort of all throughout history, it's probably worth asking why that might be. And one good place to start might be with Gordon Allport's 1954 book, The Nature of Prejudice. So Allport is actually considered to be one of the fathers of personality psychology, but that's not really what he's kind of playing at here. This isn't really personality material yet. And Allport identifies 3 causes of prejudice that might explain why prejudice is such a persistent force in humanity across basically all time and all culture. And the first cause that he identifies is the association of some groups with threat or, like annoyance or frustration, these sorts of things. It's based on sort of the idea that we automatically categorize people into many groups within seconds of seeing them. We sort of automatically clock their gender, ethnicity, age, maybe even things like class, culture, religious group, political affiliation, and so on, And all of these things are highly salient features of people to us, especially before we know much about them as an individual. And so if we form these negative associations with groups, then we will very quickly apply those negative feelings to individual members of that group. So, I think a sort of a recent important example of this is after the 9/11 attack in the United States and the 7/7 attack in London, England. That was a similar jihadist bombing that happened, I think, in 2005, but sort of on a smaller scale. After those attacks, many Westerners formed this sort of association between Muslims and threat. And this association ends up being applied to people other than Muslims too, right? People from a variety of cultural, ethnic, religious backgrounds end up being sort of perceived as Muslim and therefore perceived as threats. And then they become the target of discrimination because of this sort of association that was formed between threat and Muslims. And so to sort of illustrate this, consider the following clip that covers a story that was from the UK soon after that 7/7 attack that I mentioned a moment ago.
On Monday, the 25th of July, 2005, 4 men were renting a cottage in Haworth, West Yorkshire. They had driven up from London for a friend's wedding, and about 11:20 a.m. one of them went out to buy laundry detergent, whereupon several armed police jumped out and pinned him to the pavement at gunpoint, along with another man who just happened to be walking past. The police searched the house and the car with dogs, interrogated the men, and quickly discovered absolutno ničega. They were completely innocent. What had happened was a local resident had seen 4 men, 3 South Asian, 1 white, drive up on a Sunday night with a suspicious package and go into the house. And they'd called the cops, who responded thusly. The suspicious package turned out to be a box of mangoes, delightfully, and one of the men had recently been giving lectures at Bradford University on the need for community cohesion.
So this is a clip from a YouTuber named PhilosophyTube, and here she's describing a story in which a group of men are accosted by the police, and sort of like pretty severely accosted, you might say, basically just for being South Asian. None of them had done anything wrong, or had sort of histories that would indicate that they were a danger to society. And none of the targets of discrimination in this case had anything to do with jihadist attacks in the UK or the US, of course. no one that is the target of discrimination really had anything to do with the jihadist attacks in the US or the UK, because it was the act of a very, very small number of people. And in fact, many of the peoples, who are targets of this discrimination, including some of the people in the story, I believe, weren't even Muslim. So it's not even a sort of correct application of this negative association. But these attacks were so salient that they formed this association in the minds of many Westerners. And although the actions were carried out by just a small number of people, the association then gets applied to millions of people. But what's sort of especially notable about this, I think, is the kind of irrationality of it, because statistically speaking, in the US at least, you're much more likely to be gunned down by a right-wing white mass shooter than you are to ever be the victim of a jihadist attack, right? And many of us don't ever form these associations with white people, sort of associating white people with threat. I mean, to white people, a white person is just an in-group member, and so that group membership is not really that salient to us, and so we wouldn't form that association between white people and threat. And for non-white people, they might form that association, but chances are that if they live in the West, those non-white people likely already have associations with white people and, some particular emotional or psychological response, because white people tend to be the high status group in the West. And so it's likely not to be defined by the actions of a sort of a single violent person. And this idea is sort of kind of further illustrated by what's called realistic group conflict theory. And this is the proposal that the initial negative feelings that are felt towards a group are based in some actual conflict of some form, or in the competition for resources. So, for example, a common kind of right-wing racist talking point is that immigrants are, quote, taking our jobs. This is not based in reality, of course, but it is still coded in the language of scarcity and competition for resources. This also explains why prejudice and discrimination actually do get worse in times of scarcity or in deprivation. This has been demonstrated both sort of in the lab and in the real world, let's say. Prejudice and discrimination might be a response to these concerns about intergroup competition for scarce resources, or intergroup conflict, or intergroup threat. And it does actually occur in the case of other large-scale forms of threat. So, for example, minority groups are often scapegoated. This is where they're blamed for something that is simply not their fault, right? They're sort of made the sacrificial lamb, or blamed for something that they did not do. And actually, I can cite another sort of piece of research from here at York, this time by Rhonda Lowe, a cultural psychologist in our department, and she has work demonstrating that sort of old anti-East Asian sentiments, the so-called yellow peril kind of racist sentiments, that these actually reappeared during the COVID-19 pandemic as a way to kind of blame East Asians, scapegoat them, for the pandemic. And so you can sort of see the argument here for how the prejudice is based on a kind of on the perception of a competition for resources, or a sort of an intergroup threat of some form. That doesn't, just to be clear, that doesn't make it justified. It's just sort of trying to find the kernel of psychological experience that might explain why the prejudice emerges. And a second cause of prejudice that Allport identifies is sort of simple in-group preference, mere kind of preference for things that are familiar. So members of our in-group are sort of familiar, quote, safe, certain, right? And the more familiar we are with something, the more we tend to like it, generally speaking. This effect is sort of very well illustrated across a variety of realms in psychology. And we're going to like groups that we're more familiar with, and they can kind of behave in ways that we understand, we can anticipate, we can predict. Remember, this sort of helps to establish the certainty that I've talked about throughout this course. And the kind of evolutionary angle of this is that members of the outgroup might be dangerous, and so they might actually threaten our survival or the survival of our offspring in some way. And one sort of, I think, interesting thing to note here is that this tendency towards in-group favoritism, this kind of preference for our own group, is actually typically stronger, like on average. It's typically stronger on average than our out-group prejudice. So in other words, the tendency towards favoring our group is, in most people, sort of a stronger presence or a stronger effect than our like tendency to dislike or disfavor people in other groups. But the practical outcomes here are not that different, and in fact they may be indistinguishable in some cases. So for example, if white people prefer to hire white people, it doesn't really matter if that's because of a favoritism towards white people or if it's because of a prejudice towards, say, black people. The outcome is the same. Either way, they're going to prefer to hire a white person. So it's sort of psychologically interesting, but, in practice, it turns out that like in-group preference, out-group dispreference or dislike kind of manifest it in similar ways. And then the third cause identified by Allport is the sort of cultural worldviews that are instilled in each of us through kind of, basic social reproduction. Throughout our socialization, we're endowed with all of these various beliefs, norms, values, and so on, these sorts of good things that we've talked about all throughout the semester. And these are given to us by our parents, through our education, our friends, culture, media, the sort of usual suspects. And some of these can lead to prejudice. So the most obvious sort of example or instance of this is in places where outright prejudice is normalized. So, for example, racism in the southern United States is often just kind of openly accepted and kind of openly transmitted throughout the socialization process. Here in Canada, I don't want to excuse us. There are many places where this sort of overt anti-Indigenous sentiments are also fairly normalized and accepted, sort of commonly communicated between parents and children or something like that, and socialized into us. But the sort of more interesting angle here, I think, are the less obvious or less direct ways that these worldviews can lead to prejudice. So, for example, differences in cultural practices or cultural values, these can often be enough to support prejudicial attitudes, chiefly because we kind of intrinsically prefer our own cultural practices and our own cultural values. And I'll just kind of use a silly example here because I do actually think it's illustrative. So in most countries, it's considered rude and unsanitary to wear shoes inside someone's house, like inside your own house, or if you're a guest inside someone else's house. And so seeing Americans do this can be very kind of like jarring and bizarre. I was always confused about this as a kid when I watched American television because I couldn't understand why someone would be eating breakfast in their own house wearing sneakers. I still don't understand it really, and again, I do fall into this category where I do think it's kind of strange, right? Because I intrinsically prefer the way that I learned to do it in my culture, which is to say, generally speaking, you don't wear shoes inside your own house or inside someone else's house. But Americans probably have the opposite feeling, right? Like they probably think it's very strange that other cultures all take off their shoes inside the house. And so these differences in worldview, differences in values and norms can sort of be enough to support prejudicial attitudes towards others from, distinct cultural groups. So, again, silly example, but in this case, like, that might be enough to support sort of like, oh, well, American houses are dirty or something, or Americans like don't care about sanitation or something. I don't actually believe this. I just hopefully that's clear. I'm just sort of illustrating. So that's sort of a prejudicial attitude that I now have towards Americans, is that they're unsanitary because they wear their shoes in the house, I don't. They sort of regard us as being unsanitary in some way by wearing sort of sock foot, I guess, around the house. And there's a sort of instinctual sense that other cultural groups do things worse somehow, right? That the way that we have learned to do it, whoever the we is, it just refers to, your sort of individual case, that you do it in the better way. Your culture does it in the better way, and other cultures do it in a worse way. And we have this kind of inborn bias to favor our own cultural background, our own worldview, norms, values, and so on. And so this is the idea of ethnocentrism, this sort of preference for our own kind of culture. And we evaluate the cultures of others by comparing them to our own, usually unfavorably, but sort of treating our culture as the default and then comparing other cultures to ours kind of evaluatively, rather than accepting them as distinct entities that can't really be like evaluatively compared to our own. They're sort of their own animal, kind of, so to speak, right? They're a distinct animal that are, distinct and interesting and valuable in their own way, and you can't really kind of compare them in this evaluative way. And so if we now have a kind of an understanding of these different causes of prejudice, it might be worth asking, well, why don't we all kind of experience them equally? If these causes all kind of operate on us, it sort of asks the question, or begs the question, like, why are some people more prejudiced than others? Because clearly that's the case, right? The People's Party of Canada, it's a sort of right-wing, a little bit of an extremist group, I guess, that, they don't have any elected members of parliament, but they recently ran a federal campaign based kind of largely on racist dog whistling, and they received 830,000 votes. So, people are supporting these kinds of politicians. Just to be clear, dog whistling refers to the act of referring to a particular belief without stating it explicitly, so that your audience understands what you're saying and you understand what you're saying, but it can't be proven that you're saying it on a sort of explicit level. The sort of metaphor here is that a dog whistle, humans can't hear them, but dogs can hear them. So the person blowing the whistle knows they're making that sound. The dog can hear it, but no one else can prove that a noise is being made, if you know what I mean. Don't worry about it if you don't understand that. It's not important for the lecture. It's just sort of an example. But you can see these other similar trends in the United Conservative Party, which is a provincial party in Alberta, or even in the Federal Conservative Party of Canada. So, for example, during Stephen Harper's 9-year administration, one of the conservative MPs, in his party, was Kelly Leach. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. And she announced an RCMP tip line where Canadians could report, quote, barbaric cultural practices. So she was encouraging people to report to the police their neighbors or other people in their communities who were doing, again, quote, barbaric cultural practices. And that same woman actually ran for leadership of the Conservative Party a couple of years later. And during that run, she suggested that all new residents of Canada should be, quote, screened for Canadian values. And this is a mainstream politician, it's worth noting, not some fringe extremist who's like handing out flyers in Yonge and Dundas, right? She was an elected member of parliament for 8 years, and she was also the minister responsible for the status of women for 2 years. So evidently there's a market for this sort of prejudice among some people, but seemingly not to the same extent for everyone. And so, what accounts for this, do you think? What accounts for this individual difference of kind of susceptibility to prejudice? And one effect is likely personality. This sort of individual differences that can make us more susceptible to this prejudicial thinking and to discriminatory behavior. And the most common personality constructs that are associated with prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory behavior are right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. So right-wing authoritarianism, often shortened to RWA, is the belief in a strict social hierarchy and sort of the power differences in society. And people who are high in RWA show submission to authorities. This is kind of the crucial bit, I think. They show submission to authorities that they regard as being legitimate. And they're also aggressive against others in the name of those authorities, especially against people that they regard as being lower in the social structure. So they sort of understand that they can wield some amount of authority over other people in the name of sort of the authority that they submit to. And people who are high in RWA also tend to show traditional values and traditional lifestyles, sort of the kind of traditional Western conservative idea of how you should live your life and what your values should be. And they also tend to endorse sort of strict sanctioning of people who don't conform to those same values and lifestyles. Social dominance orientation, on the other hand, is often shortened to SDO. This deals with a kind of a similar idea, and there's definitely overlap here, but this refers really specifically to the endorsement of hierarchy and inequality in society, and sort of the idea that like some individuals and groups deserve to have more power than others, and society should be organized to give those people more power and less power to the people that, don't deserve it, that are less deserving. And the obvious application here is along the kind of typical lines of systematic inequality, things like race, gender, sexuality, these sorts of things. But it can also just be based on wealth, right? Consider the typical right-wing talking point of kind of meritocracy, right? This is the idea that if you work hard, you get what you deserve. So the wealthy must deserve to be wealthy because they worked hard for it. And the poor deserve to be poor because they're lazy or incompetent or, they didn't work hard enough for it. There's a Korean adage that I like that kind of roughly translates to the rich are innocent, the poor are guilty. And this is the idea that just by virtue of being rich, it means you've already sort of worked hard. You've already kind of justified your own existence. But the poor didn't work hard enough, have not justified their own existence, their own value, right? And so this idea, this social dominance orientation, it kind of endorses the validity of inequality and hierarchy. And it also kind of intimates that the current organization of society is a good one. It sort of supports the idea that the inequality that already exists is actually justified. We shouldn't do things to reduce or change that inequality because it's the sort of natural order and it is a good thing. And these two ideas, RWA and SDO, they are related, like there's clear overlap and sort of relation here, but they're slightly different. So people who are high in right-wing authoritarianism are more likely to be prejudiced against kind of untraditional, sort of quote, scare quotes, untraditional people, such as, people who are LGBT, whereas people who are high in social dominance orientation are more likely to be prejudiced against sort of lower status groups, people that they regard as being sort of naturally low in society's hierarchy. So this might be the unemployed, the disabled, again, people that they regard as being low power and justifiably low power. And the, like someone who's high in right-wing authoritarianism might be sort of a nationalist and a racist. So like the alt-right would be very high in right-wing authoritarianism, for example. And social dominance orientation refers kind of to a more mainstream idea of like the sort of mainstream fiscal conservative idea or sort of classical liberal idea that inequality is both good and necessary, that it's actually a good thing that there is inequality in society because it motivates us and it rewards people who work hard and disincentivizes laziness or whatever. And you know, it is worth pointing out that like this idea of inequality as being a good thing to maintain in society is like it's a fairly mainstream common idea. It ultimately guides both the ruling parties in the U.S. and arguably both the ruling parties, like the Tories and the Liberals in Canada as well. So it's not as extreme as right-wing authoritarianism. Even if people never really put it this plainly, like most people probably would not tell you that inequality is good, but all of their sort of political beliefs point towards that fact, right? But you know, also worth noting that right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation are positively correlated. If you are high in one, you tend to be high in the other as well. So, you know, a lot of right-wingers are just simply high in both of these constructs. And of course, being high in these constructs makes you more susceptible towards prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory behavior. But one, I guess, kind of notable thing about prejudice and discrimination in our modern era, you know, the sort of the world that we live in today, is that it seems to be somewhat less overt, right? There are definitely explicit manifestations of it. Don't get me wrong. You know, police brutality, obviously, and police extrajudicial executions. You know, these are disproportionately carried out against like black people and, you know, indigenous people, right? But generally speaking, it's considered unacceptable to be like openly racist or openly homophobic, you know, here in sort of in North America. You know, insert your type of bigotry here, not just racist and homophobic, but, you know, insert other types of bigotry as well. At least in kind of like many of the domains of society, right? And this is why, just kind of returning back to a few minutes ago, this is why the PPC, the People's Party of Canada, have to use these dog whistles, because it's considered unacceptable to be kind of explicitly or openly bigoted in this way. So what's going on here, right? We know it still exists, but it's sort of hidden a little bit. So, I mean, in the case of racism, psychologists use a couple of different terms to help clear up this tension, this sort of like, we know it exists, but we can't see it as well. And this is sort of usually applied directly to racism, but I also think that it likely is fairly universal to other forms of inequality or prejudice, and probably applies to other marginalized groups as well. And so the first concept that we're going to talk about here to help kind of explain these subtleties of modern prejudice is what's called ambivalent racism. And so this is when an individual holds multiple conflicting beliefs about a racial group. And it kind of manifests in this more kind of quiet, implicit form of prejudice. So you can see this sort of thing in like the kind of centrist liberal mindset. It's very common in Canada and you know, other kind of Western Anglo countries. So like you have one belief that non-white people have been subjected to additional obstacles throughout history, you know, that they're sort of been given a worse deal, to put it very mildly. So that's one belief. But you also believe that every individual is ultimately responsible for their own success. And so anyone who wants to get ahead in society should just try harder. So you simultaneously think that some groups are disadvantaged, but you also think that individuals are responsible for themselves. So, you know, group disadvantages, how much can they really affect things if you as an individual are still responsible for your own success, right? There's a tension here, there's a conflict. And this set of beliefs would be characterized as racial ambivalence, because it demonstrates sort of two conflicting beliefs about a racial group that can kind of resolve in different ways depending on the circumstance. So if your sense of racial justice, your sort of egalitarian minded, your need for equality is primed, if the sort of situation calls for you to be more mindful of these sorts of values, then someone with racial ambivalence will endorse those values more strongly. They'll lean more harder in the progressive way, right? They'll support things like affirmative action. But if they're kind of liberal individualist values are primed, they're kind of meritocratic, or their belief that you're ultimately just responsible for your own lot in life, then they'll lean more heavily on the reactionary belief, the idea that individuals should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And so in this way, ostensibly tolerant people who kind of profess to have these progressive beliefs, they can still be primed to demonstrate more prejudicial attitudes, or primed to demonstrate more progressive, egalitarian attitudes. And, this very much isn't the sort of overt prejudice that we're used to thinking about and discussing. And, we sort of, the kind of explosive examples, right? But it likely is a more common form. It's likely a more insidious form. It's a little bit of a difficult, difficult concept, but hopefully you all sort of understand the sort of idea here of having two beliefs, one kind of positive, one kind of negative, that are conflicting, and how different situations can either make you lean harder on the positive belief about a racial group, or lean harder on a negative belief about a racial group. And then the next concept that we're going to discuss is what's called aversive racism. And so this is a little bit closer to the kind of overt form of racism or discrimination that we're used to thinking about, but it's still not quite explicit. And so this refers to the kind of negative, often unconscious feelings that are held towards different racial groups. And they don't manifest as explicit or intentional discrimination, really. But rather they kind of emerge in subtle ways, like general avoidance of racial group, say for example black people, or sort of a general discomfort with certain racial groups, right? And it's often within research, it's often discussed in the context of workplaces. And in some studies, it's been demonstrated that white people are less likely on average to choose a black person as their partner in a particular research study. It's not based on sort of explicit conscious discriminatory beliefs or like prejudice. It's not an act. It's not a conscious act of discrimination. It's sort of more subtle. It's sort of a general discomfort or avoidant kind of feeling towards racial groups. The study mentions a specific textbook that I think is really interesting. It's pretty delicate and nuanced, I think. So in this study, they have a victim basically who needs help. And when the participant, the person who's actually being tested, the victim is obviously a Confederate, right? They've been placed there by the researchers. But when the participant is given an opportunity to help the victim, they do it almost all the time, regardless of whether the victim is black or white, if they're alone. So if the participant comes upon a victim and there's no one else around, they're basically always going to help that person, regardless of whether they're black or white. And just to sort of specifically refer to the graph here, that's what this condition shows, right? So whether the victim is black or the victim is white, with a very high proportion, the participant will help the victim. However, when there are other people around, that's when things get interesting. So if the victim is white, then the white participant, I should be clear, is likely to help the victim. But if there are other people around and the victim is black, then the chances of the participant helping the victim go way down. Presumably because, they think to themselves, well, there are lots of other people here. Someone else will help the person in need, right? Someone else will sort of do this for me. But they don't seem to think that nearly as often in the case where the victim is white. And so, it's not a conscious, it doesn't seem to be a conscious, explicitly negative attitudes towards black people that is driving this behavior, because if it was, they probably wouldn't help the black victim in this case when they come upon the person alone. It's sort of in these sort of more less clear situations, right, where there's more kind of flexibility, where they can do something that is discriminatory without really kind of acknowledging the fact or recognizing the fact that they've done something discriminatory. And so that's sort of how this is, how aversive racism kind of manifests itself in these very kind of like subtle ways that might not be obvious to either the person who's doing it or the person who's receiving it. Frankly, it's sort of a general discomfort that people show towards other groups. And this sort of gets at one of the topics that is of particular special interest in social psychology, which is what's called implicit prejudice. And, we've actually talked about this topic a bit already in this semester, but implicit prejudice refers to negative attitudes towards a group that we're generally not aware of, as in we're not aware of the attitudes, not the group. And again, this is likely the form of prejudice that most people in the modern era in the West demonstrate. Again, the majority of people, not everyone. And most people in the West in the modern era do not actually show any explicit prejudicial attitudes towards other racial groups, for example. But many do seem to show implicit prejudice on the measures that claim to be able to measure this sort of thing, these unconscious negative attitudes towards groups that we don't even know we have. And one of the ways that you can do this is with physiological measures. So, for example, we can measure kind of like your facial muscle contractions when you're interacting with someone from another group, usually from another racial group, or we can measure your cardiovascular responses, like how fast or hard your heart is beating, or what's called your galvanic skin response, which is kind of like how much you're like kind of sweating, how much you're kind of showing physiological arousal. And the kind of common interpretation here is that these physiological responses betray a sort of fear or discomfort or stress in response to the idea of, for example, working with other members or with members from other ethnic groups. We also have cognitive tools for assessing this implicit prejudice, and we actually talked about one of these extensively already, which is the IAT, or the Implicit Attitudes Test. Just to sort of quickly catch you up, maybe these images will help remind you, but you do sort of hundreds of these tasks where you first categorize people as being either black people or white people, and then you do these tasks where you categorize words as being either good or bad words, and then you do these tasks where you characterize both words and people, and sort of you do a couple of different versions of this, and then through some sort of complicated math, it claims to show what a person's association is between like black people and the concept of bad, basically. And this is the most commonly used measure of an implicit prejudice, the IAT is. But it's also come under heavy criticism, and I think we talked about this a little bit as well last time we talked about the IAT, because it's not clear what the IAT actually measures. Does it measure prejudice, like the implicit prejudice that people sort of say it measures? Or does it just measure an awareness of this prejudice, like the knowledge that this prejudice exists in society, but not necessarily within the individual? Or maybe it might even sort of be demonstrating an association between black people and bad, because it refers to an awareness that black people have been kind of treated badly. This would also, some of these other alternative explanations might explain why sort of a very high proportion of black people show this on the IAT, show this association. They show an association, a stronger association between black people and bad. And of course, white people show it at a very high proportion as well. And there are also kind of other problems with this measure because people can kind of freak out when they're worried that they might be labeled as racist. And that also makes the whole thing a bit dicey because like this is based on very subtle reaction times. And if you're kind of freaking out a little bit that you're worried you might be categorized as racist, then that might also screw up kind of reaction time measures. So there are a lot of, I think, justified concerns about our use and interpretation of the IAT. And I think that, you know, this isn't my area of expertise, but the impression that I get is that, you know, measurement of implicit prejudice is still very much a difficult thing to do. And we don't really have a perfect way of doing it. And it's might even be that it's, you know, too difficult to do in a way that is really reliable or really valid. But again, you know, not my area. Someone who studies this stuff directly might feel, you know, very differently, might have a very different impression of that field. But regardless of this whole kind of dicey measurement issue, implicit prejudice is still a very important concept. And in some ways it's the kind of the one that we have to worry about, right? Explicit prejudice is often, by definition, like out in the open, right? You know, the sort of the marches that all those, you know, alt-right people do, right? Like the kind of open hatred that some people in this world demonstrate. That's the kind of explicit stuff. But implicit prejudice, that's a lot more insidious. It can be kind of enacted without anyone recognizing that anything shady or any discrimination has even taken place. And it can even be enacted against members of one's own group without realizing it. You know, someone can sort of discriminate against members of their own group because of the kind of how insidious this sort of implicit prejudice is and how it can worm its way into our heads if you're sort of a member of a lower status group. And for this reason, I think it remains an area of kind of high and continued interest in social psych. So let's just do a sort of a quick wrap up, a quick summary of everything we discussed today. So the first thing we did was discuss what I called the implements of inequality: prejudice, stereotypes, discrimination. And we kind of we explained the relationship between these three concepts. They're the attitudes, beliefs, and actions that are associated with this kind of intergroup bias. And next we discussed some of the reasons that prejudice is such a persistent force in humanity. And in particular, we discussed Gordon Allport's 3 causes of prejudice. And we explained how they kind of cognitively, you know, kind of prepare humans to be prejudiced in a way, kind of almost naturally. That might be too loaded a word here, but, you know, it sort of explains why prejudice is such a persistent, ubiquitous force across time and space and culture. And then we talked about the role of personality in prejudice, and we specifically talked about right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, and how these constructs might explain the sort of susceptibility, I guess, to prejudicial attitudes. And then finally, we discussed the subtleties of the kind of modern manifestations of prejudice, how it kind of exists without being overt some of the time, and how it might explain some of the modern forms of discrimination that we sort of know exist in this world. So that's all for today. This topic is a little bit difficult to discuss because in some ways it does an injustice to cram it into a single lecture. But as I've kind of mentioned before, I have kind of limited time in this course, and so I have to do these kind of brief overviews of some topics, even when they're very important both to the world and to psychological research. And so, I kind of wish that I had more lectures that I could dedicate to this topic, but hopefully that was an interesting and a useful introduction to this world. And there are a lot of great literatures that are accessible, I think, on this topic, that are, written by or prepared by people who have a better level of expertise than I do. So yeah, thanks so much for your attention, and let's do some quick media recommendations, kind of relevant to this lecture. So you're sort of overwhelmed, I think, with options when it comes to media related to things like prejudice. And so the temptation to choose something directly or really clearly and simply related to the topic, I tried to resist that temptation and instead choose things that were a little bit more off the beaten path. So hopefully you can follow me down that path. And the first recommendation I have for you is a science fiction novel. It's a Chinese science fiction novel by the author Liu Cixin, and it's called The Three-Body Problem. It's their first book in a trilogy. The trilogy is called The Remembrance of Earth's Past, and this is one of my favorite books. I think it's excellent. I could not put it down when I first read it. And in some ways, it's a difficult book to talk about because I think that the less you know about it, the better it will be, the more you will enjoy it. So all I'll say is that I think it does a really excellent job of covering intergroup conflict and the kind of natural emergence of prejudice in society. And if you enjoy science fiction literature, I cannot recommend it more highly. It and its two follow-up books are just incredible. My next recommendation is not the comic Watchmen by Alan Moore, which I love, but rather the very unusual HBO adaptation of Watchmen that came out a couple years ago. It's a television show. It's pretty short. It's only one season. And in some ways it shouldn't even be called Watchmen because it barely relates to many of the topics covered in Watchmen, either sort of thematically or literally. But it is an excellent television show that is pretty explicitly actually about discrimination, prejudice, both sort of overt and implicit forms of prejudice and discrimination. And you don't really have to even have read the comic to understand it because it takes place after the comic and, like I said, barely relates to the comic. So I recommend it highly. I think it was just an amazing, incredible show from start to finish, and it's pretty short. And then the final recommendation I have is kind of a cheap one because I was going to recommend Parasite, but so many of you probably have seen Parasite, right? Like, it was such a phenomenon when it came out, and then it won the Oscar for Best Film. So, like, that's a bad suggestion. Parasite's amazing. You should watch it if you haven't seen it, but many of you have already seen it, and that's not what I want these recommendations to be for. So I'm gonna cheat and instead provide a wealth of other Korean media recommendations because it turns out Korean fiction very commonly deals with the concept of inequality and prejudice. It turns out to be a major theme in their sort of cultural mindset or their cultural output. And so the other cheat or a sort of bad recommendation here is Squid Games because, again, it's such a phenomenon that many of you have already seen it, but amazing television show, strongly recommended as long as you've got a strong stomach. There's some sort of extreme violence in it. So let's get a little bit less of a thing that everyone has seen. If you want something that's just a nice K-drama, it's funny, it's sweet, but it deals very explicitly with the concept of inequality and prejudice and discrimination. Reply 1988 is a great show on Netflix, and it's not violent or gory or troubling. It's just about a small neighborhood and a series of families who are typically nice to one another, but also sort of explicitly shows the sort of inequality associated with poverty in Korea. Snowpiercer is actually an English language movie, but directed by Bong Joon-ho, who directed Parasite, and in some ways it is just Parasite, but with a different veneer, a different kind of theme, sort of more science fiction-y, but very similar themes. Again, sort of strongly recommend it. I don't think it's as good as Parasite, but it's a really fun movie, and if you don't really like subtitles, this movie is actually English language primarily. So, and then finally, and this is one of my, I guess, like strongest recommendations here, is the Vengeance trilogy by Park Chan-wook, I think, is the director. So this is 3 movies that are thematically related, but not related in terms of content. Like, you don't have to watch one to understand the other, but all 3 of them are amazing. In particular, I really love Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. And all of these movies are very extreme in terms of violence and sort of unsettling content. So, be warned, I guess. But they're all, I think, very kind of excellent and subtle investigations, again, of like inequality and prejudice and how inequality manifests in Korea. Because again, it seems to be a very kind of clear theme that emerges in their fiction. And actually, now while I'm talking about it, the movie The Handmaiden, also directed by Park Chan-wook, also covers that, and it's also an amazing movie. So, I sort of wanted to be a bit cheeky here by sort of referencing a bunch of different pieces of Korean media that some of you may not have heard of, despite the kind of recent renaissance in the West of kind of Korean movies and television. So, these are worth checking out if you're curious. Okay, thanks again for your attention, and I'll see you next week.